Picture this. You serve tea with a smile to the man who whipped your mother to death, all while secretly training his prized hunting dogs to tear him apart. In 1854, on the sprawling cotton fields of South Carolina's Ashley River, 20-year-old Sarah Bennett perfected the art of invisible hatred, orchestrating one of the most calculated acts of revenge in American slavery history. What happened at Magnolia Grove Plantation wasn't just murder, it was psychological warfare so sophisticated that it fooled everyone until the very moment Colonel Edmund Whitmore found himself face to face with his own beloved hounds, their eyes no longer recognizing him as master, but as prey. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of how a house slave turned a symbol of oppression into an instrument of justice, using nothing but patience, intelligence, and an intimate understanding of both human and animal nature. A tale so disturbing that local authorities buried every record, so calculated that it required 3 years of preparation, and so perfectly executed that even today, forensic experts struggle to understand exactly how Sarah Bennett accomplished what she did. The year 1854 found South Carolina's lowcountry drowning in cotton money and slave labor, where the Ashley River carried both wealth and human misery downstream towards Charleston's bustling markets. Magnolia Grove Plantation stretched across 2,000 acres of prime bottomland, its white-columned mansion rising like a monument to prosperity built on human suffering. The statistics were staggering even by antebellum standards. Cotton prices had reached unprecedented heights of 15 cents per pound, transforming plantations into money-printing machines that generated monthly profits exceeding what most northern factories earned in entire years. Colonel Edmund Whitmore had inherited this empire at 25, but had spent the following 2 decades perfecting systems of control that made neighboring plantation owners both envious and horrified. His innovation wasn't just in cotton cultivation, though his fields produced yields that consistently outperformed regional averages. Whitmore's true genius lay in psychological domination, in understanding that fear could be manufactured, refined, and deployed with scientific precision. He had transformed cruelty from an emotional reaction into a calculated business strategy. The plantation operated under what Whitmore called his educational system, a methodical approach to breaking human spirits that he had developed through careful study of military discipline, animal training, and what he termed Negro psychology. Every aspect of slave life was regulated, monitored, and adjusted to maintain optimal productivity while preventing any possibility of organized resistance. Slaves were categorized into detailed hierarchies based not just on work assignments, but on psychological profiles that Whitmore maintained in leather-bound ledgers locked in his study. But it was Whitmore's hunting operation that revealed the true depths of his sadism. The colonel maintained 37 purebred hunting dogs across multiple breeds, each animal trained for specific purposes in what he euphemistically called property recovery expeditions. The kennels behind the main house resembled a military installation with precisely organized runs, training facilities, and breeding areas that represented an investment of thousands of dollars. These weren't merely hunting dogs, they were weapons of terror, trained to track human scent with deadly efficiency. The hunting parties that gathered at Magnolia Grove every autumn had become legendary throughout the region, drawing plantation owners from as far as Georgia and North Carolina. But locals whispered about activities that went beyond traditional fox hunting. Escaped slaves weren't simply returned when caught. They became training exercises, opportunities for Whitmore to demonstrate his dog's capabilities while providing entertainment for his guests. The psychological effect on the remaining slave population was exactly what Whitmore intended. The sound of baying hounds triggered panic that could be heard for miles. This was the world into which Sarah Bennett had been born, a universe where every moment of existence served the pleasure and profit of others. At 20, she possessed the refined mannerisms expected of a house slave. the carefully cultivated deference that kept her valuable and relatively safe. Her light brown skin and delicate features had marked her for indoor work from childhood, sparing her the brutal field labor that killed most slaves before 40. She could read, though teaching slaves literacy was illegal, having learned through careful observation and secret practice with discarded newspapers. But Sarah's most dangerous quality was her memory. She remembered everything with photographic precision, every slight, every act of cruelty, every moment of humiliation inflicted on herself and others. While other slaves might forget specific incidents of abuse, Sarah cataloged them in mental files that she reviewed and organized with scholarly precision. She had been documenting Whitmore's patterns of behavior for over a decade, building a psychological profile that would have impressed trained military strategists. The catalyst for Sarah's transformation from passive observer to active architect of revenge came on a humid July morning in 1851 when she witnessed the death of her mother, Ruth Bennett. Ruth had been caught teaching alphabet letters to slave children using scratches in the dirt, a violation of South Carolina's strict anti-literacy laws. Whitmore's punishment was designed to serve as permanent warning to other slaves about the consequences of intellectual development. Ruth was tied to the whipping post in the plantation's central courtyard, positioned so that every slave would have clear sight lines to the proceedings. Whitmore personally administered 50 lashes with a braided leather whip while forcing Sarah to count each strike aloud. When Ruth lost consciousness around the 30th lash, Dr. Morrison revived her with smelling salts so the punishment could continue. The physician's participation wasn't unusual. Morrison regularly attended plantation punishments, ostensibly to prevent deaths that would represent lost property value. But Ruth didn't survive the ordeal. Her heart failed on the 47th lash, while Sarah watched helplessly from 20 feet away. Whitmore showed no emotion at the loss of a valuable slave, simply ordered her body removed and added the financial loss to his ledger with the notation, educational expense. The casual callousness of his reaction, the clinical way he calculated the cost of her mother's life, crystallized something profound in Sarah's consciousness. That night, sitting beside her mother's body in the slave quarters, Sarah made a decision that would consume the next 3 years of her life. She wouldn't simply kill Whitmore. Death was too quick, too merciful for someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of human suffering. She would destroy him using the very system he had created, turning his own innovations against him with interest compounded over years of careful planning. The first phase of Sarah's preparation involved becoming indispensable to the Whitmore household while appearing completely harmless. She volunteered for additional duties, demonstrated exceptional skill in food preparation, and developed expertise in household management that made her valuable beyond her original role as personal servant to Mrs. Catherine Whitmore. Her preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Strategy was counterintuitive. Most slaves sought to minimize contact with their masters, but Sarah deliberately increased her access while perfecting a mask of cheerful servility. Within 6 months, Sarah had positioned herself as head house slave, responsible for coordinating meals, managing other domestic servants, and maintaining the daily routines that kept the great house functioning. The role provided unrestricted access to every room in the mansion, detailed knowledge of family schedules, and most importantly, intimate familiarity with Whitmore's personal habits and psychological vulnerabilities. She learned his morning routines, his preferred foods, his drinking patterns, and his methods of relaxation. But Sarah's real education was taking place in the kennels, where she convinced Thomas Reed, the aging head dog handler, to accept her assistance with feeding and basic care. Reed was a broken man whose spirit had been crushed by decades of training dogs to hunt human beings, but he retained genuine affection for the animals themselves. Sarah presented her interest as simple curiosity about animal care, gradually demonstrating knowledge and skill that made her presence helpful rather than burdensome. The kennels became Sarah's laboratory for understanding canine psychology and behavior modification. She spent hours observing how different dogs responded to various commands, studying their pack hierarchies, and learning the subtle techniques Reed used to maintain control over such powerful animals. Most importantly, she began to understand the conditioning methods that had taught these dogs to associate human scent with prey rather than companionship. Sarah discovered that Whitmore's dogs had been systematically trained using techniques that violated natural canine instincts. Normally, dogs possessed strong inhibitions against attacking humans, but careful conditioning had overcome these protective mechanisms. The training involved exposing puppies to human scent while experiencing hunger, pain, or fear, creating psychological associations between human presence and negative stimuli. Adult dogs were maintained in carefully controlled states of aggression through feeding schedules, isolation, and reward systems that reinforced hunting behaviors. Understanding this conditioning process was crucial to Sarah's developing plan. If dogs could be trained to hunt humans through systematic psychological manipulation, the same techniques could theoretically be used to reverse their training. But such an operation would require months of careful work, access to the animals during vulnerable periods, and most importantly, the ability to modify their behavior without detection by their handlers. Sarah began her counter-conditioning program gradually, using her legitimate access to the kennels during feeding times to implement subtle changes in the dog's routine. She started by introducing variations in feeding schedules that created different psychological states, mixing small amounts of herbs from the plantation's medicinal garden into their food, and most importantly, establishing herself as a consistent presence in their environment during positive experiences. The herbal supplements were critical to Sarah's strategy. Working with Martha Webb, an elderly slave who served as the plantation's informal medical advisor, Sarah identified local plants that could influence animal behavior without causing obvious symptoms. Valerian root could induce relaxation, while small amounts of wild ginseng could affect energy levels. Most importantly, certain combinations of herbs could heighten sensitivity to scent and sound, making the dogs more responsive to specific triggers. Martha Webb represented a crucial alliance in Sarah's developing conspiracy. At 68, Martha was one of the few slaves who remembered life before Whitmore's innovations, who had survived multiple masters and understood the long-term patterns of plantation life. She possessed encyclopedic knowledge of local plants, traditional African medical practices, and the psychological techniques that had allowed her to survive decades of brutality. Martha recognized the determination in Sarah's eyes, the same look she had seen in other slaves who had chosen death over continued submission. The alliance between Sarah and Martha developed through careful conversations during late-night medical emergencies, when Martha would be called to treat injuries or illnesses in the slave quarters. Sarah volunteered to assist with these treatments, gradually demonstrating knowledge of herb preparation and medical theory that impressed the older woman. Their relationship deepened through shared understanding of loss, mutual respect for intelligence, and recognition that they possessed complementary skills that could be devastating if properly coordinated. Martha had spent decades perfecting the art of invisible resistance, using her medical knowledge to provide slaves with remedies that helped them endure their circumstances while occasionally providing relief that masters couldn't detect. She understood which plants could induce temporary illnesses that would excuse slaves from particularly brutal work assignments, which herbs could treat injuries without leaving evidence of medical intervention, and most importantly, which substances could affect human behavior in subtle but significant ways. Under Martha's guidance, Sarah learned to identify dozens of native plants and their physiological effects. She mastered techniques for extracting concentrated essences, for combining different substances to achieve specific results, and for administering medications in ways that would be undetectable to casual observation. But Martha's valuable contribution was teaching Sarah to think like a physician, to understand the human body as a complex system that could be influenced through careful intervention. The two women spent months developing what they privately called their educational program, a systematic approach to modifying both animal and human behavior that would culminate in Whitmore's destruction. The plan required patience, precision, and the ability to maintain their deception for years while gradually implementing changes that would only become apparent at the moment of execution. By late 1852, Sarah had achieved remarkable success in modifying the behavior of several key dogs in Whitmore's pack. The animals had begun responding to her presence with relaxation rather than aggression, accepting food from her hands, and demonstrating loyalty that concerned some of the other handlers. Thomas Reed attributed these changes to Sarah's natural affinity for animals, never suspecting that she was systematically retraining creatures that represented the most potent symbols of slave oppression. But Sarah's most ambitious conditioning involved Whitmore's personal favorite, a massive Catahoula leopard dog named Caesar, who served as the pack's alpha and Whitmore's most trusted hunting companion. Caesar was a formidable animal, 90 pounds of muscle and aggression that had been personally trained by Whitmore since puppyhood. The dog accompanied his master on all hunting expeditions, slept outside Whitmore's bedroom door, and had been conditioned to respond to specific commands that made him particularly effective at human tracking. Modifying Caesar's behavior represented Sarah's greatest challenge and most crucial objective. The dog's loyalty to Whitmore was absolute, reinforced by years of careful conditioning and regular hunting expeditions that strengthened their bond. But Sarah understood that this very loyalty could be redirected if she could establish herself as an alternative source of positive reinforcement while gradually undermining Caesar's association with his current master. The process required 18 months of patient work, during which Sarah provided Caesar with special treats during periods when Whitmore was absent, introduced scents and sounds that created positive associations with her presence, and most importantly, began administering carefully measured doses of herbs that enhanced the dog's sensitivity to environmental changes. The goal wasn't to make Caesar love her more than Whitmore, but to create psychological confusion about pack hierarchy and leadership that could be exploited at the crucial moment. Sarah Bennett appeared to be everything Colonel Whitmore valued in house property. At 20, she possessed the refined bearing that distinguished valuable domestic servants from field hands, moving through the great house with practiced grace that never disrupted the rhythms of white family life. Her honey-colored skin and carefully maintained appearance reflected the investment Whitmore had made in her upbringing, while her deferential manners suggested complete acceptance of her station. Guests frequently complimented Whitmore on his slave's exceptional training, noting how seamlessly she anticipated needs and maintained household order. But this carefully constructed exterior concealed one of the most dangerous minds ever to emerge from American slavery. Behind Sarah's lowered eyes and respectful silence operated an intellect that had transformed years of observation into strategic knowledge. She understood human psychology with clinical precision, having spent her entire life studying the behavioral patterns of people who held absolute power over her existence. Every gesture, every word, every moment of interaction had been analyzed and cataloged in memory systems that would have impressed university scholars.
Sarah's intellectual development had begun in early childhood through clandestine lessons with her mother Ruth, who had recognized exceptional potential in her daughter's quick mind and flawless memory. Ruth had risked severe punishment to teach Sarah basic literacy, using coal fragments to scratch letters on wooden boards that could be quickly erased if discovery threatened. But Sarah's education extended far beyond reading and writing. Ruth had taught her to observe human nature, to recognize the subtle signs that revealed people's true thoughts and intentions beneath their spoken words. The loss of her mother had crystallized her understanding that survival required more than mere obedience. She needed to become invisible while remaining indispensable, to demonstrate value while concealing capability, to appear grateful while nurturing hatred so profound it could sustain years of careful planning. This psychological balancing act required constant vigilance and perfect emotional control, transforming every interaction into a performance that could determine her life or death. Sarah's position as head house slave provided unprecedented access to the intimate details of Whitmore family life. She witnessed private conversations between husband and wife, observed their relationships with neighbors and business associates, and most importantly, studied the psychological dynamics that govern their decision-making processes. She learned that Mrs. Catherine Whitmore possessed sadistic tendencies that actually exceeded her husband's cruelty, finding particular pleasure in devising punishments for female slaves that combined physical pain with psychological humiliation. The knowledge Sarah accumulated about the Whitmore family's private lives created opportunities for manipulation that she exploited with surgical precision. She learned which topics of conversation would distract them during crucial moments, which domestic arrangements would position her advantageously for observation or action, and most importantly, which routine services would make her presence so normal that she became functionally invisible even during sensitive discussions. But Sarah's most sophisticated manipulation involved her relationship with Dr. Henry Morrison, the plantation physician, whose regular visits provided her with crucial intelligence about the broader regional situation. Morrison was a weak man whose participation in plantation brutality stemmed from financial dependence rather than genuine sadism. His medical knowledge was valuable to Whitmore, but his obvious discomfort with slave punishments revealed psychological vulnerabilities that Sarah learned to exploit. During Morrison's visits to treat sick slaves, Sarah positioned herself as his unofficial assistant, demonstrating medical knowledge that impressed him while providing opportunities for carefully crafted conversations. She learned to ask questions that appeared to stem from genuine curiosity about medical practice, gradually extracting information about human physiology, drug effects, and most importantly, methods for influencing behavior through chemical means. Morrison, flattered by her apparent intellectual interest and grateful for competent assistance, shared knowledge that no slave ever ought to have access to,
should have possessed. Through these conversations, Sarah learned about alkaloids that could affect human consciousness, plant-based compounds that could induce various physiological responses, and most crucially, substances that could influence decision-making and perception without causing obvious symptoms. Morrison's medical texts, which he sometimes left unattended during treatments, provided additional information that Sarah memorized through quick reading sessions that had to be completed in minutes. The intelligence Sarah gathered about regional politics and economic conditions proved equally valuable for her long-term planning. Through overheard conversations between Whitmore and his business associates, she learned about political tensions between slave states and free territories, economic pressures affecting plantation profitability, and, most importantly, the growing influence of abolition movements that were creating paranoia among slave owners throughout the region. This broader context informed Sarah's understanding that individual revenge, while personally satisfying, might not provide the lasting impact she desired. The system that had created Whitmore would simply produce another equally brutal replacement unless the psychological foundations of white supremacy were challenged in ways that created permanent doubt about the supposed inferiority of enslaved people. Her revenge needed to demonstrate intellectual sophistication that would force uncomfortable questions about the fundamental assumptions underlying slavery itself. Sarah's preparation extended to developing relationships with other slaves that could provide both intelligence and operational support when her plans reached the implementation phase. She cultivated these alliances carefully, identifying individuals whose personal grievances against the Whitmore family aligned with her objectives while avoiding anyone whose loyalty might prove unreliable under pressure. The network she constructed was based on mutual benefit rather than sentimental friendship, with each participant understanding their specific role without knowing the complete scope of her intentions. Rebecca Mills, the head cook, became a crucial ally through their shared responsibility for food preparation and household management. Rebecca had survived 15 years at Magnolia Grove by developing expertise in nutrition and meal planning that made her indispensable. But she harbored profound hatred for Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, who had sold Rebecca's teenage daughter to settle gambling debts. Sarah recognized this grievance as motivation that could be channeled into operational assistance, gradually involving Rebecca in preparations that appeared to be routine household improvements. Samuel Cross, the plantation blacksmith, represented another essential alliance. His metalworking skills and access to tools made him valuable for manufacturing specialized equipment that Sarah's plans would require, while his position in the slave hierarchy provided him with intelligence about activities throughout the plantation. Samuel had been brutally punished 2 years earlier for allegedly stealing iron to make weapons, a false accusation that had cost him 3 fingers and left him with permanent hatred for Whitmore's arbitrary cruelty. The relationship Sarah developed with Samuel required delicate maneuvering, as his suspicious nature and previous experience with false accusations made him wary of any activities that might be interpreted as rebellious. She approached him through legitimate requests for household metalwork, gradually demonstrating trust and competence that convinced him she could be relied upon for more sensitive collaboration. Their alliance was cemented through shared understanding that individual survival depended on collective action, even if that action had to remain invisible to outside observers. Thomas Reed's cooperation with Sarah's kennel activities represented the most delicate relationship in her developing network. Reed genuinely cared for the hunting dogs, despite understanding their role in oppressing other slaves, creating psychological conflicts that Sarah learned to navigate through careful emotional manipulation. She positioned her assistants as motivated by simple affection for animals, while gradually introducing ideas about improving their care and training that aligned with her secret objectives. Reed's decades of experience with animal behavior provided Sarah with knowledge that proved crucial for understanding how Whitmore's dogs could be psychologically reprogrammed. He explained the specific techniques used to condition young dogs for human hunting, the feeding schedules that maintained optimal aggression levels, and most importantly, the command structures that gave Whitmore absolute control over their behavior. This information was essential for developing counter-conditioning methods that could reverse years of specialized training. But Sarah's relationship with Thoms required constant management to prevent him from recognizing the true purpose of her questions and activities. She learned to frame her inquiries as stemming from genuine concern for animal welfare, while introducing modifications to feeding and training routines that appeared to be minor improvements rather than systematic behavior modification. The success of this deception required her to maintain perfect consistency in her persona as a caring but naive young woman whose interest in the dogs was purely emotional. Martha Webb's role in Sarah's conspiracy extended far beyond herbal knowledge into strategic planning and psychological counseling that helped maintain Sarah's emotional stability during years of preparation. Martha had survived multiple masters and witnessed countless acts of resistance, both successful and catastrophic, providing her with wisdom about the psychological challenges of maintaining long-term deception while nurturing homicidal intentions. She understood the mental toll of living with constant hatred while appearing grateful and content. Under Martha's guidance, Sarah learned techniques for compartmentalizing her emotions, for maintaining the psychological separation between her public persona and private intentions that was essential for avoiding detection. Martha taught her meditation practices, adapted from African spiritual traditions, methods for channeling anger into productive planning rather than self-destructive rage, and, most importantly, strategies for maintaining hope during periods when progress seemed impossible. The herbal education Martha provided went far beyond simple plant identification into sophisticated understanding of how natural compounds could affect both human and animal physiology. Sarah learned to prepare concentrated extracts using distillation techniques that Martha had perfected over decades of clandestine medical practice. She mastered how to combine multiple plants to create potent combinations that could either heal or kill, depending on the precise dosage and specific method of administration. Methods for combining different substances to achieve specific effects, for calculating dosages based on body weight and individual sensitivity, and for administering medications in ways that would be undetectable to casual observation. Most importantly, Martha taught Sarah to think like a poisoner, understanding the human body as a complex chemical system that could be influenced through careful intervention. They studied the effects of different alkaloids on consciousness and decision-making, the ways various plant compounds could affect perception and memory, and the subtle physiological changes that could create vulnerability without causing obvious symptoms. This knowledge was essential for the final phase of Sarah's plan, when she would need to ensure Whitmore's complete helplessness during his encounter with the modified dogs. The psychological preparation Martha provided proved equally crucial for Sarah's long-term stability. Maintaining hatred intense enough to sustain years of dangerous planning while appearing cheerful and grateful required extraordinary emotional control that could easily deteriorate into madness if not properly managed. Martha helped Sarah develop mental exercises that allowed her to access her anger when planning required motivation, while compartmentalizing it during daily interactions that demanded convincing performance. Sarah's intellectual development during this period extended into areas that would have been impossible for most slaves to access. Through careful observation and strategic questioning, she learned about plantation economics, regional politics, and the broader social forces that maintained the slavery system. She understood that Whitmore's power derived not just from legal ownership, but from economic relationships, political connections, and social networks that provided mutual support among the planter class. This broader understanding informed Sarah's recognition that effective revenge required more than simply killing Whitmore. His death needed to occur in circumstances that would create lasting psychological impact on other plantation owners, demonstrating that slaves possessed capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about racial inferiority. The method of his destruction had to reveal intellectual sophistication that would force uncomfortable questions about the supposed natural order that justified human bondage. By early 1854, Sarah had transformed herself into something unprecedented in the history of American slavery, a strategic mastermind whose capabilities rivaled those of military officers or political conspirators, while maintaining perfect camouflage as a grateful and simple-minded house servant. Her network of allies had been carefully constructed and tested through minor operations that demonstrated their reliability without revealing the ultimate objective. Her knowledge of chemistry, animal behavior, and human psychology had reached levels that would have impressed university scholars. Most importantly, Sarah had identified the precise method by which Colonel Edmund Whitmore would die. The plan she had developed combined poetic justice with practical effectiveness, ensuring that the man who had used dogs to terrorize slaves would be destroyed by those same animals in circumstances that would appear to be a tragic accident, while actually representing the culmination of years of careful preparation. The psychological conditioning of Whitmore's hunting dogs had reached the point where Sarah could influence their behavior through subtle chemical and environmental triggers that would be invisible to observers but decisive in determining their response to specific situations. Caesar and the other alpha dogs now associated her scent with positive experiences, while maintaining their apparent loyalty to Whitmore, creating the psychological confusion that would prove fatal when properly exploited. Sarah's understanding of Whitmore's personal routines, physical vulnerabilities, and psychological blind spots had reached encyclopedic completeness. She knew his preferred hunting locations, the circumstances under which he hunted alone versus with companions, and most importantly, the specific behavioral triggers that could manipulate him into making decisions that would position him optimally for her purposes. The man who prided himself on absolute control over every aspect of plantation life had become utterly predictable to someone who had studied him with scientific precision. The herbal preparations Sarah had developed could influence human perception and decision-making in ways that would cause Whitmore to misinterpret crucial environmental signals during the final encounter. The substances she had identified would create subtle alterations in his awareness and reaction time, without causing symptoms obvious enough to alert him to danger. Combined with the dog conditioning and environmental manipulation, these chemical factors would ensure that every element of the encounter proceeded according to her design. But perhaps most remarkably, Sarah had accomplished this preparation while not only avoiding suspicion, but actually enhancing her value to the Whitmore household. Her efficiency, reliability, and apparent devotion had made her indispensable to family operations, ensuring that her access and privileges would continue right up to the moment of implementation. She had become the perfect weapon, invisible, trusted, and positioned exactly where she needed to be to execute the most sophisticated act of slave resistance in American history. The transformation of Sarah Bennett from grieving daughter to strategic mastermind represented more than personal evolution. It demonstrated intellectual capabilities that the slavery system was designed to deny existed among enslaved people. Her ability to conduct complex planning while maintaining perfect deception challenged every assumption about racial inferiority that justified human bondage. The sophistication of her preparation rivaled that of professional military officers or political conspirators, achieved despite having no formal education or access to strategic training. Most disturbing for the plantation system was Sarah's demonstration that apparent loyalty could mask intentions that were not just rebellious, but strategically sophisticated. If a house slave who appeared completely devoted could spend years planning an operation of this complexity, how many other slaves were concealing similar capabilities behind masks of servility? Sarah's very existence as a strategic mastermind represented an existential threat to the psychological foundations of white supremacy. The network Sarah had constructed among the plantation's enslaved population revealed organizational capabilities that planters assumed were impossible without white supervision. Her ability to identify reliable allies, assign specific roles, maintain operational security, and coordinate complex activities while avoiding detection demonstrated leadership skills that challenged fundamental assumptions about the supposed natural order of racial hierarchy. Perhaps most significantly, Sarah had accomplished her preparation using knowledge systems that combined African traditions with American innovations, creating hybrid approaches to problem solving that drew on intellectual resources the slavery system was designed to suppress. Her integration of traditional herbal knowledge with modern chemical understanding, her combination of psychological insight with strategic planning, and her synthesis of individual grievance with systematic resistance represented intellectual achievements that transcended the educational limitations imposed on enslaved people. As 1854 progressed toward the autumn hunting season, Sarah Bennett stood ready to execute a plan 3 years in the making. Every element had been tested, every contingency considered, every detail refined through careful observation and patient preparation. The woman who served tea with a smile while planning her master's destruction represented the ultimate nightmare of the plantation system, an enslaved person whose intellectual capabilities not only equaled those of their oppressors, but had been focused with laser precision on achieving the most perfectly calculated revenge in the history of American slavery. The autumn of 1853 brought unexpected opportunities that would accelerate Sarah's timeline beyond her original projections. A yellow fever epidemic swept through Charleston's port districts, creating labor shortages that forced plantation owners throughout the region to modify their operational patterns. Magnolia Grove found itself hosting extended visits from neighboring planters whose own properties had been disrupted by illness and death, creating circumstances that Sarah recognized as potentially decisive for her long-term objectives. Dr. Morrison's increased presence at the plantation during this period provided Sarah with access to medical knowledge that proved transformative for her understanding of human physiology under extreme stress. The physician's treatment of fever victims required him to maintain detailed records of symptoms, medication effects, and physiological responses that Sarah observed and memorized during her assistance with patient care. She learned to recognize the subtle signs of delirium, the physical manifestations of terror, and most importantly, the ways fear could compromise cognitive function, even in healthy individuals. The epidemic also brought new slaves to Magnolia Grove, as Whitmore purchased property from financially devastated neighbors at reduced prices. Among these acquisitions was a middle-aged man named Joseph Carter, whose previous owner had been a Charleston physician specializing in experimental treatments. Joseph possessed knowledge of drug preparation and human anatomy that exceeded even Martha Webb's considerable expertise, having served as an unofficial medical assistant for over a decade before his master's death from fever. Joseph's integration into Sarah's network required delicate negotiation, as his medical knowledge made him potentially valuable, but also dangerous if his loyalties proved unreliable. Sarah approached him through Martha, who conducted careful conversations designed to assess his psychological state and potential reliability. The evaluation process extended over several weeks, during which Joseph demonstrated both exceptional competence and profound bitterness toward the medical establishment that had exploited his knowledge while denying him any recognition or compensation. The alliance with Joseph expanded Sarah's capabilities exponentially, providing access to pharmaceutical knowledge that enabled far more sophisticated chemical interventions than had previously been possible. Joseph understood the precise mechanisms by which various substances affected neural function, the calculation methods necessary for determining safe but effective dosages, and, most importantly, the preparation techniques that could concentrate natural compounds into forms that were both potent and undetectable when properly administered. Under Joseph's guidance, Sarah learned to create chemical preparations that could influence human behavior in ways that appeared to be natural responses to environmental stress rather than artificially induced conditions. She mastered techniques for extracting alkaloids from common plants, methods for combining different compounds to achieve synergistic effects, and procedures for administering substances through skin contact, inhalation, or food consumption without leaving detectable traces. Most significantly,
Joseph taught Sarah to understand the human nervous system as a complex network that could be manipulated through targeted chemical intervention. She learned which neurotransmitter pathways controlled fear responses, how various compounds could affect perception and reaction time, and the specific physiological changes that occurred when humans experienced extreme terror. This knowledge was essential for ensuring that Whitmore would be psychologically and physically incapable of defending himself during the final encounter. The expanded network also included several slaves from neighboring plantations, whose owners had been forced to seek temporary refuge at Magnolia Grove during the epidemic. These individuals brought intelligence about regional conditions, political developments, and most importantly, information about other plantation owners' security measures and behavioral patterns. Sarah recognized that her operation's success might create opportunities for similar actions elsewhere, requiring coordination that extended beyond the boundaries of a single property. Among these temporary residents was a young woman named Clara Davidson, whose owner had been experimenting with new methods of psychological control based on theories about Negro inferiority that were gaining popularity among progressive planters. Her experience provided Sarah with insights into the psychological vulnerabilities of planters who prided themselves on scientific understanding of racial differences. Clara's knowledge proved particularly valuable for understanding how educated whites could be manipulated through their own assumptions about black intellectual capacity. She had observed how her former master's scientific pretensions created blind spots that prevented him from recognizing intelligence when it was displayed by enslaved people,
demonstrating that intellectual arrogance could be exploited as effectively as any other psychological weakness. This understanding informed Sarah's recognition that Whitmore's confidence in his own superiority would prevent him from recognizing the sophistication of her planning until it was too late to matter. The epidemic period also provided Sarah with opportunities to test her chemical preparations on human subjects under controlled conditions. Dr. Morrison's treatment protocols included experimental medications whose effects Sarah could observe while appearing to provide nursing assistance. She learned to recognize the subtle signs of chemical influence on human consciousness, the time intervals required for various substances to take effect, and most importantly, the dosage levels that could influence behavior without causing symptoms obvious enough to alert medical observers. These observations enabled Sarah to refine her preparations with scientific precision, ensuring that her final intervention would achieve exactly the psychological and physiological effects necessary for success. She developed multiple formulations designed for different administration methods, each calibrated to produce specific results within predetermined time frames. The sophistication of her chemical arsenal rivaled that of professional pharmacists, achieved through careful observation and systematic experimentation that would have impressed university researchers. The autumn hunting season of 1853 provided Sarah with crucial opportunities to observe Whitmore's hunting practices under conditions that closely approximated those she would create for his final encounter. She accompanied hunting parties as part of the domestic staff responsible for preparing meals and maintaining camp facilities, positions that allowed her to study Whitmore's behavior patterns, decision-making processes, and most importantly, his interactions with the hunting dogs under various environmental conditions. During these expeditions, Sarah observed how Whitmore's confidence in his own superiority led him to take risks that more cautious hunters would avoid. His belief in the absolute loyalty of his dogs caused him to venture into situations where he was physically vulnerable, relying on their protection in circumstances that could become dangerous if their behavior was compromised. This overconfidence represented the psychological weakness that Sarah would exploit during their final encounter. The hunting expeditions also provided opportunities to test her influence over the dogs under field conditions. Sarah discovered that the chemical and behavioral conditioning she had implemented could override their normal responses to Whitmore's commands when combined with specific environmental triggers that she could create through careful preparation. The dog's apparent loyalty remained intact during normal circumstances, but their underlying programming had been sufficiently altered to ensure different responses when subjected to the combination of chemical, psychological, and environmental factors that would characterize their master's final hunt. Most importantly, Sarah learned to predict with remarkable accuracy how Whitmore would respond to various hunting scenarios, enabling her to design an encounter that would unfold according to her specifications while appearing to be a tragic accident. His behavioral patterns were so consistent that she could manipulate environmental conditions to produce predetermined responses, ensuring that every aspect of their final meeting would proceed according to her design, while maintaining the appearance of natural causation. The winter months of 1853-1854 were devoted to finalizing the logistical preparations that would support Sarah's operational plan. Working with Samuel Cross, she commissioned the fabrication of specialized equipment designed to appear innocuous while serving crucial functions during the implementation phase. These items included modified feeding devices that could deliver chemical preparations to the dogs without leaving evidence, environmental triggers that could be positioned to influence animal behavior at predetermined moments, and most importantly, mechanisms for ensuring that all physical evidence of human intervention would be eliminated after the encounter. Samuel's metalworking expertise enabled the creation of devices whose sophistication far exceeded what plantation authorities would expect slaves to be capable of producing. His understanding of mechanical principles, combined with access to high-quality materials from the plantation's equipment reserves, made possible innovations that were both functionally effective and virtually undetectable when properly employed. The equipment represented a fusion of traditional craftsmanship with scientific understanding that demonstrated intellectual capabilities the slavery system was designed to suppress. Rebecca Mills's role in the preparation involved developing food-based delivery systems for the chemical preparations that would influence both human and animal behavior during the final encounter. Her expertise in nutrition and food chemistry enabled the creation of substances that could be administered through normal feeding routines without altering taste, appearance, or smell in ways that would alert recipients to their presence. The sophistication of these preparations required understanding of biochemistry that exceeded the knowledge of most professional cooks. The food-based delivery systems were particularly important for ensuring that Whitmore would consume the substances necessary to compromise his cognitive function and physical coordination during the crucial encounter. Rebecca developed methods for incorporating the active compounds into foods that Whitmore consumed regularly, calculating dosages that would achieve the desired effects without causing symptoms that might alert him to chemical intervention. The timing of administration was calibrated to ensure peak effects would occur precisely when needed. Martha Webb's contribution during this period focused on the spiritual and psychological preparation necessary to sustain Sarah's emotional stability during the final phases of planning. The elderly woman understood that maintaining homicidal intentions while appearing grateful and content required extraordinary mental discipline that could deteriorate under pressure if not properly supported. Her guidance helped Sarah develop meditation techniques, emotional compartmentalization strategies, and psychological resilience methods that would prevent discovery of her true intentions. The spiritual preparation Martha provided drew on African traditions that had sustained resistance efforts throughout the history of slavery, adapted to the specific circumstances of Sarah's situation. These practices included visualization techniques that helped maintain focus on long-term objectives, emotional regulation methods that prevented betraying anger during daily interactions, and most importantly, philosophical frameworks that justified extreme action as moral necessity rather than criminal behavior. Perhaps most crucially, Martha helped Sarah understand that her operation represented more than personal revenge, but a form of warfare against the entire system of human bondage. This broader perspective provided psychological foundation for actions that might otherwise have been impossible to sustain over extended periods. Sarah learned to view herself not as a potential murderer, but as a soldier, in a war that had been declared against her people long before her birth. The spring of 1854 brought final adjustments to Sarah's timeline as regional political developments created additional pressures that could affect her operational environment. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had intensified tensions between slave and free territories, creating paranoia among plantation owners who feared that political instability might encourage slave resistance. These concerns led to increased security measures throughout the region, requiring modifications to Sarah's plan that would account for heightened vigilance and expanded patrol activities. The political tension also created opportunities that Sarah recognized as potentially beneficial for her objectives. Plantation owners' fears about slave resistance made them more likely to interpret accidents as natural occurrences rather than suspicious events, providing psychological cover for operations that might otherwise attract unwanted attention. The regional atmosphere of anxiety and suspicion could work to her advantage if properly exploited through careful timing and environmental manipulation. Sarah's final preparations included establishing communication protocols with her network that would enable coordination during the implementation phase while maintaining plausible deniability if investigations followed Whitmore's death. Each participant understood their specific role without knowing the complete scope of the operation, ensuring that discovery of any individual element would not compromise the entire conspiracy. The compartmentalization was so thorough that even torture would be unlikely to extract information that could implicate other participants. The summer months were devoted to final testing of all chemical, mechanical, and behavioral elements that would be employed during the autumn hunting season. Sarah conducted systematic trials of her preparations under various environmental conditions, confirming that each component would function as designed when subjected to the temperature, humidity, and lighting conditions that would characterize the final encounter. The testing process revealed minor adjustments needed to ensure optimal effectiveness, modifications that were implemented with scientific precision. Most importantly, Sarah completed her psychological preparation for the personal cost of her operation. She understood that success would likely require her own death, as the sophistication of her planning would inevitably be discovered during any thorough investigation. Her choice was between living as a slave with the knowledge that her mother's death had gone unavenged, or achieving justice while accepting the probability of execution. The decision had been made years earlier, but required constant reinforcement to maintain resolve during periods when success seemed uncertain. The final element of Sarah's preparation involved creating false trails and alternative explanations that would confuse any investigation while protecting her co-conspirators from discovery. She developed multiple scenarios that could account for Whitmore's death through natural causes, mechanical failure, or simple accident, ensuring that authorities would have plausible explanations that did not require acknowledging the intellectual sophistication of enslaved people. The deception was so thorough that even participants in her network could genuinely believe they had been involved in routine activities rather than homicidal conspiracy. By late summer 1854, Sarah Bennett had completed the most sophisticated assassination plan in the history of American slavery. Every element had been tested, every contingency considered, every participant prepared for their role in an operation that would demonstrate intellectual capabilities the plantation system was designed to deny existed among enslaved people. The woman who served tea with perfect deference while planning the most calculated act of revenge in the antebellum South represented everything that white society feared most. An enslaved person whose mind could not be controlled, whose hatred could not be satisfied through punishment, and whose capabilities exceeded those of the people who claimed ownership of her life. The psychological transformation that had begun with her mother's death was now complete. Sarah had evolved from grieving daughter into strategic mastermind, from victim into agent of justice, from property into person whose intellectual achievements would challenge every assumption about the supposed natural order of racial hierarchy. Her operation would prove that apparent loyalty could mask capabilities that rivaled those of military officers, that domestic servants could possess knowledge that exceeded that of their masters, and that the system of human bondage contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The hunting season of 1854 would reveal whether 3 years of preparation, countless hours of observation, and unprecedented intellectual achievement could overcome the centuries of force and terror that sustained American slavery. Sarah Bennett stood ready to discover if intelligence, patience, and perfectly calculated hatred could triumph over the system that had transformed human beings into property and justified that transformation through claims of natural inferiority that her very existence contradicted. The stage was set for an encounter that would test not only Sarah's planning and preparation, but the fundamental assumptions upon which an entire civilization had built its economic and social structure. Colonel Edmund Whitmore would face more than the hunting dogs he had trained to terrorize other human beings. He would confront the intellectual achievement of a woman whose mind he had never bothered to acknowledge, whose capabilities he had never thought to fear, and whose hatred he had never imagined could be transformed into precision instrument of justice that would challenge everything he believed about the natural order of the world. October arrived at Magnolia Grove with the crisp clarity that characterized South Carolina's finest hunting weather, bringing with it the annual gathering of plantation elite
Colonel Whitmore had cultivated into the region's most prestigious social event. The 1854 hunting season promised to be exceptional, with guests arriving from as far as Virginia and Georgia to participate in expeditions that combined sport with the brutal entertainment that characterized planter society's darkest traditions. Sarah Bennett watched the preparations with the focused intensity of a general observing enemy movements, recognizing that the convergence of so many influential witnesses would provide perfect cover for the operation she had spent 3 years perfecting. The guest roster included some of the most powerful men in the antebellum South, plantation owners whose combined wealth exceeded that of entire northern cities and whose political influence shaped regional policy on slavery, trade, and territorial expansion. Among them was Judge William Hayes from Columbia, whose legal interpretations had strengthened enforcement of fugitive slave laws throughout the state. Senator Robert Caldwell brought his reputation for eloquent defenses of human bondage as a positive good that civilized both races. Dr. Marcus Thornton arrived with his collection of skulls and measurements designed to prove scientific theories of racial hierarchy that justified the entire plantation system. Each guest represented not merely an individual target for Sarah's psychological warfare, but a symbol of the intellectual arrogance that sustained white supremacy through claims of scientific legitimacy. Their presence at Magnolia Grove during Whitmore's final hunt would ensure that his destruction occurred before witnesses whose own assumptions about black intellectual inferiority would prevent them from recognizing the sophistication of Sarah's planning. The irony was deliberate and carefully calculated to maximize the operation's long-term psychological impact. Sarah's final preparations during the week preceding the hunt involved implementing modifications to the plantation's routine that would position every element of her conspiracy for optimal effectiveness. Working through her established network, she arranged for specific changes in the dogs' feeding schedule that would heighten their sensitivity to the chemical triggers she had developed. Rebecca Mills adjusted meal preparations to ensure that Whitmore would consume precisely calculated doses of the compounds that would compromise his cognitive function during the crucial encounter. The chemical preparations Sarah had perfected represented the culmination of years of study and experimentation that would have impressed professional pharmacists. The primary compound was extracted from Datura stramonium, a plant that grew wild throughout the Carolina Low Country and was known locally as Jimson weed. When properly processed, The alkaloids it contained could produce subtle alterations in perception and judgment that would be virtually undetectable to casual observation, while proving decisive in determining behavior under stress. Sarah had learned to concentrate these alkaloids into forms that could be administered through multiple delivery methods, ensuring redundancy that would guarantee effectiveness even if individual components failed. The primary dose would be delivered through Whitmore's morning coffee, utilizing Rebecca's position as head cook to ensure proper administration. Secondary doses were incorporated into his preferred tobacco blend, taking advantage of his habit of smoking while reviewing hunt plans. Tertiary preparations were embedded in the leather conditioning oil used to maintain his riding equipment, providing skin absorption that would reinforce the effects of oral consumption. The timing of these administrations was calibrated with scientific precision to ensure peak effectiveness would occur during the mid-afternoon period when Whitmore typically conducted his solo reconnaissance of hunting grounds. Sarah had observed his patterns sufficiently to predict his movements with remarkable accuracy, enabling her to position environmental triggers and behavioral cues that would guide him toward the specific location where her modified dogs would be waiting. The location Sarah had selected for the final encounter was a clearing approximately 2 miles from the main house, surrounded by dense undergrowth that would limit visibility while providing multiple escape routes for the hunting dogs after completing their work. The site was accessible only through narrow paths that would prevent rapid response by other hunters, ensuring that Whitmore would face his fate without intervention from potential rescuers. Most importantly, the clearing contained a natural depression that would facilitate disposal of evidence while creating the appearance of an accidental fall that had triggered the dog's attack. Thomas Reed's unwitting cooperation in modifying the dog's training routine had progressed to the point where Sarah could predict and control their behavior with the precision of a master puppeteer. The primary modification involved reversing their learned associations with Whitmore's scent, transforming his master from pack leader into potential prey through careful conditioning that exploited their predatory instincts. This psychological reprogramming had been accomplished gradually through exposure therapy that associated Whitmore's personal scent with negative stimuli during feeding periods when their aggressive instincts were naturally heightened. The most sophisticated aspect of Sarah's dog conditioning involved Caesar, Whitmore's personal favorite and the pack's dominant alpha. Caesar's loyalty to his master had been legendary throughout the region, making him an obvious target for Sarah's most intensive reprogramming efforts. Over 18 months of careful work, she had succeeded in creating psychological confusion about pack hierarchy that could be triggered through specific chemical and environmental cues that would be present during the final hunt. The conditioning process had required Sarah to understand canine psychology at levels that exceeded the knowledge of most professional animal trainers. She learned to recognize the subtle behavioral indicators that revealed emotional states in individual dogs, enabling her to time her interventions for maximum effectiveness. Most importantly, she discovered that the same techniques used to train dogs for human hunting could be reversed to make them view their former masters as legitimate targets under specific circumstances. Martha Webb's spiritual guidance during the final week focused on preparing Sarah for the psychological aftermath of successful revenge, helping her understand that achieving justice for her mother's death would not necessarily provide the emotional satisfaction she had anticipated. The elderly woman had witnessed other acts of resistance throughout her long life, observing how the moment of triumph often turned into an emptiness that paralyzed the survivor.
Brought unexpected psychological complications that could be more difficult to endure than the original oppression. Under Martha's guidance, Sarah developed meditation techniques that would help her maintain emotional stability during and after the operation, regardless of its outcome. These practices drew on African spiritual traditions that emphasized acceptance of fate while maintaining commitment to action, enabling warriors to face death with dignity while fighting for principles that transcended individual survival. The psychological preparation was essential for ensuring that Sarah could execute her plan with the calm precision necessary for success. The spiritual framework Martha provided also helped Sarah understand her operation within the broader context of resistance that had characterized the African experience in America since the beginning of slavery. Her mother's death and her own response represented individual elements in a larger pattern of oppression and resistance that connected her struggles to those of countless others who had faced similar circumstances throughout history. This perspective provided psychological foundation for actions that might otherwise have seemed overwhelming in their moral complexity. On the morning of October 15th, as dawn broke clear and cold across the Ashley River, Sarah Bennett began implementing the final phase of an operation that represented the most sophisticated act of individual resistance in the history of American slavery. Every element had been tested, every contingency planned, every participant positioned for their assigned role in a choreographed sequence of events that would appear to unfold naturally while actually following Sarah's precise specifications. The morning routine proceeded exactly as Sarah had designed, with each chemical preparation administered according to the calculated schedule that would ensure optimal effectiveness during the crucial afternoon period. Whitmore consumed his morning coffee while reviewing hunt plans with his guests, displaying the confident arrogance that had characterized his interactions with enslaved people throughout his career. His conversation revealed complete ignorance of the intellectual capabilities that surrounded him daily, demonstrating the psychological blind spots that Sarah's operation was designed to exploit. Rebecca Mills's execution of the poisoning protocol was flawless, with the datura compounds incorporated into Whitmore's breakfast and tobacco so skillfully that even careful observation would not have revealed any alteration in taste, appearance, or aroma. The head cook's decades of experience in food preparation enabled her to achieve chemical integration that would have challenged professional pharmacists, ensuring that Whitmore would consume precisely the doses necessary to compromise his judgment and coordination during the afternoon hunt. Samuel Cross had positioned the mechanical elements of Sarah's plan with equal precision, installing environmental triggers that would influence the dog's behavior at predetermined moments while remaining invisible to human observers. These devices included scent dispensers that would release chemical attractants at specific times, sound generators that would produce frequencies known to agitate hunting dogs, and most importantly, mechanisms for ensuring that all physical evidence of human intervention would be eliminated after the encounter. As the morning progressed into afternoon, Sarah observed the subtle onset of chemical effects in Whitmore's behavior and demeanor. The datura alkaloids were producing exactly the intended results, creating mild disorientation and impaired judgment that would prove decisive during his encounter with the modified dogs. His movements became slightly less coordinated. His decision-making process showed evidence of confusion, and most importantly, his awareness of environmental details decreased to levels that would prevent him from recognizing danger signals that might otherwise have enabled escape. The hunting party that assembled after lunch included 12 of the most influential men in the antebellum South, their combined political and economic power sufficient to influence regional policy on slavery, territorial expansion, and the legal framework that sustained human bondage throughout the Cotton States. Their presence as witnesses to Whitmore's fate would ensure maximum psychological impact from Sarah's demonstration of intellectual capabilities that challenged every assumption about racial hierarchy. Whitmore's decision to conduct solo reconnaissance of the hunting grounds followed patterns that Sarah had observed and documented over 3 years of careful study. His confidence in his own superiority and his trust in the absolute loyalty of his hunting dogs created precisely the psychological vulnerabilities that her operation was designed to exploit. As he rode toward the predetermined location, accompanied only by Caesar and 2 other dogs, he was moving according to a script that Sarah had written through years of patient observation and careful manipulation. The clearing where Sarah had positioned her trap represented the culmination of logistical planning that rivaled military operations in its complexity and precision.
Every environmental factor had been calculated to ensure optimal conditions for the encounter, from wind direction that would carry scent triggers to lighting conditions that would affect visibility and perception. The location provided perfect acoustics for the sounds that would drive the dogs into predatory frenzy, while being sufficiently isolated to prevent intervention by other hunters. When Whitmore entered the clearing at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, the chemical preparations in his system had reached peak effectiveness, creating the precise combination of disorientation and reduced awareness that Sarah had calculated would be necessary for her plan's success. His inability to recognize the environmental triggers that were influencing his dog's behavior would prove fatal, demonstrating that intellectual arrogance could be as dangerous as any physical weapon when properly exploited by superior intelligence. The first indication of trouble came when Caesar failed to respond to Whitmore's standard commands, instead displaying agitation and predatory focus that violated years of careful training. The great dog's confusion about pack hierarchy, created through Sarah's patient conditioning, was being triggered by the combination of chemical scents and environmental stimuli that she had positioned throughout the clearing. Whitmore's impaired judgment prevented him from recognizing the danger signals that might have enabled escape during the crucial first moments. The attack, when it came, unfolded with terrifying precision according to Sarah's choreographed specifications. Caesar's assault was followed immediately by the other
dogs, their coordinated behavior demonstrating the effectiveness of her psychological reprogramming. Whitmore's attempts to reassert control through verbal commands proved useless, as the animals no longer recognized him as pack leader, but instead responded to him as prey that had been marked for destruction through carefully implanted conditioning. The savagery of the attack exceeded even Sarah's expectations, as 3 years of suppressed predatory instincts were released simultaneously in a display of violence that would have shocked even observers accustomed to the brutalities of plantation life. Whitmore's screams echoed through the forest for several minutes before being silenced forever, his death achieving the poetic justice that Sarah had spent years planning while appearing to be a tragic accident that could be attributed to animal unpredictability rather than human intelligence. The aftermath of the attack proceeded exactly as Sarah had anticipated, with the dogs' conditioning causing them to flee the scene immediately after completing their work, their behavior pattern designed to suggest that they had been frightened by their own actions rather than acting according to predetermined programming. The environmental triggers that had influenced their assault automatically eliminated themselves through chemical decomposition, leaving no evidence of human intervention that could survive forensic examination. When search parties discovered Whitmore's remains 2 hours later, the scene appeared to confirm exactly the narrative that Sarah had constructed to explain his death. The location suggested that he had suffered an accidental fall that had triggered an unexpected aggressive response from dogs that had never before shown hostility toward their master. The physical evidence supported this interpretation so completely that even suspicious investigators would find no indication of foul play, despite the sophistication of the planning that had actually determined every aspect of the encounter. The psychological impact on the assembled plantation elite exceeded Sarah's most optimistic projections, as men who had spent their careers proclaiming the intellectual inferiority of enslaved people struggled to comprehend how such a tragedy could have befallen someone as knowledgeable about animal behavior as Colonel Whitmore. Their confusion and terror revealed the extent to which their sense of security depended on assumptions about black intellectual limitations that Sarah's operation had effectively challenged without their recognition. Dr. Marcus Thornton's examination of the scene provided unintentional validation of Sarah's planning, as his scientific analysis confirmed that the evidence supported accidental death rather than deliberate murder. His reputation for expertise in forensic matters lent credibility to conclusions that protected Sarah's network from suspicion while demonstrating that even educated professionals could be deceived by sufficiently sophisticated planning. The irony of having racial theorists validate her intellectual achievement without recognizing it was precisely the psychological warfare that Sarah had intended. Judge William Hayes's legal interpretation of the incident established precedents that would influence similar cases throughout the region. His ruling that accidental death by animal attack represented an unfortunate but natural consequence of plantation life rather than evidence of human intervention. The legal framework he created actually protected other potential resistance operations by establishing that sophisticated planning would not be considered as an explanation for events that could be attributed to animal unpredictability. Senator Robert Caldwell's political response to Whitmore's death involved increased security measures throughout the region, but these changes were designed to address threats that bore no resemblance to the actual methods Sarah had employed. His inability to recognize the true sophistication of her operation meant that the countermeasures he implemented would be ineffective against similar resistance activities, creating opportunities for other enslaved people to employ comparable tactics without detection. The regional investigations that followed Whitmore's death consumed months of effort by some of the South's most experienced law enforcement officials, but their inquiries were doomed to failure because they were based on assumptions about slave intellectual capacity that prevented recognition of the planning sophistication that had actually determined events. Sarah's success in creating a perfect crime was achieved not through superior resources or external assistance, but through intellectual capabilities that the investigators were psychologically incapable of acknowledging. Sarah Bennett's survival of the investigation period represented perhaps the most remarkable aspect of her entire operation, as she maintained perfect performance of grateful servility while being questioned by officials whose suspicions could have resulted in her torture and execution. Her ability to present convincing evidence of simple-minded devotion to the Whitmore family while concealing intellectual achievements that exceeded those of her interrogators demonstrated psychological control that would have impressed professional actors. The months following Whitmore's death brought Sarah a complex mixture of satisfaction and emptiness that Martha Webb had predicted during their spiritual preparation sessions. The achievement of perfect revenge for her mother's murder provided emotional validation, but also revealed the psychological costs of maintaining homicidal hatred for extended periods. The meditation techniques Martha had taught her proved essential for processing emotions that were more complicated than she had anticipated. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore's decision to sell Magnolia Grove and relocate to Charleston provided Sarah with unexpected opportunities for escape that she had not included in her original planning. The disruption of established routines created circumstances that enabled her to disappear during the confusion of property transfer, beginning a new phase of her life that would remain hidden from historical records. Her survival represented a final victory over the system that had sought to reduce her to property while being destroyed by her intellectual capabilities. The legacy of Sarah Bennett's operation extended far beyond the death of a single plantation owner into broader questions about the intellectual capabilities of enslaved people that white society was not prepared to confront. Her demonstration that apparent loyalty could mask planning sophistication that rivaled military operations challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy that justified the entire slavery system. The fact that her success remained unrecognized by contemporary authorities represented a testament to the systematic devaluation of black intellectual capabilities that characterized the structure of slave society.
Only emphasize the extent to which white supremacy depended on willful ignorance rather than empirical evidence. The story of Sarah Bennett represents more than individual revenge or personal triumph over oppression. Her intellectual achievements demonstrated capabilities that the slavery system was designed to deny existed among enslaved people, proving that limitations imposed through legal and social restrictions were artificial rather than natural. Her ability to conduct complex operations while maintaining perfect deception revealed strategic thinking that exceeded the abilities of most professional military officers, achieved despite having no formal education or access to conventional training.
Perhaps most significantly, Sarah's operation proved that the most dangerous resistance to slavery came not from external abolition movements or political opposition, but from the intellectual capabilities of enslaved people themselves, when properly focused and systematically applied. Her success demonstrated that human intelligence could not be permanently suppressed through force or legal restriction, and that the apparent stability of plantation society depended on psychological illusions that could be shattered by sufficiently sophisticated resistance. The deliberate erasure of Sarah Bennett's story from historical records followed patterns that characterized official responses to other demonstrations of Black intellectual achievement during the antebellum period. Authorities understood instinctively that acknowledging her capabilities would undermine the ideological foundations of human bondage, forcing uncomfortable questions about the justice and sustainability of a system based on supposed natural inferiority. Her invisibility in conventional historical narratives represents not accidental oversight, but systematic suppression designed to protect psychological assumptions that made slavery seem morally acceptable. Colonel Edmund Whitmore died believing in his own superiority over the woman who had orchestrated his destruction with precision that exceeded his own strategic capabilities. His final moments of terror and confusion represented the ultimate inversion of power relationships that slavery was designed to prevent, proving that intelligence and determination could overcome advantages of legal authority, economic resources, and social position when properly applied through patient planning and perfect execution. Sarah Bennett's revenge stands as testament to the intellectual potential that slavery sought to suppress, the human capacity for strategic thinking that no legal system could permanently eliminate, and the ultimate futility of building civilizations on foundations of willful ignorance about human nature and capability. Her story reveals that the most sophisticated resistance to oppression often remains invisible to those in power, achieving victory through methods that authorities are psychologically incapable of recognizing or understanding. The Charleston slave market bustled with its usual morning activity as potential buyers examined human property with the same critical attention they might devote to livestock or agricultural equipment. Among the enslaved people standing on the auction block was a young woman whose composed demeanor and refined appearance marked her as valuable domestic property, the kind of house slave that wealthy families competed to acquire for their city residences. The auctioneer's description emphasized her excellent training, impeccable references from her previous owner, and demonstrated competence in all aspects of household management that made her worth the premium price being demanded. Sarah Bennett had reinvented herself completely during the 6 months since fleeing Magnolia Grove Plantation, transforming from architect of sophisticated revenge into the perfect embodiment of grateful servitude that Charleston's elite families sought for their establishments. Her ability to assume this new identity while concealing the intellectual capabilities that had enabled her to orchestrate Colonel Whitmore's destruction represented perhaps the most remarkable aspect of her entire story, demonstrating psychological adaptability that exceeded the skills of professional actors or trained intelligence operatives. The forged documents that established her new identity as Mary Washington had been obtained through connections Martha Webb had maintained with Charleston's free Black community, networks of resistance that operated beneath the notice of white authorities while providing crucial support for escaped slaves seeking to establish new lives. The elderly woman's decades of experience in covert activities had enabled her to facilitate Sarah's transformation with efficiency that impressed even those familiar with Underground Railroad operations throughout the region. Sarah's new owner was Dr. Hamilton Pierce, a prominent Charleston physician whose medical practice served the city's wealthiest families, while his academic interests focused on anatomical research that supported scientific theories of racial hierarchy. Pierce's reputation for treating slaves with relative humanity stemmed not from moral opposition to brutality, but from recognition that valuable property required proper maintenance to preserve its economic value. His household represented the kind of enlightened slavery that progressive Southerners promoted as evidence of the system's benevolent evolution. The Pierce mansion on Meeting Street provided Sarah with living conditions that were luxurious compared to plantation quarters, but also presented new challenges that required constant vigilance to maintain her carefully constructed identity. The urban environment of Charleston offered opportunities for intellectual stimulation and cultural development that had been impossible at Magnolia Grove, but also created risks of exposure through encounters with people who might recognize capabilities that exceeded those expected from enslaved domestic servants. Dr. Pierce's extensive medical library became Sarah's secret university, providing access to anatomical texts, pharmaceutical references, and scientific journals that expanded her knowledge far beyond what she had learned through clandestine study and practical experience. Her position as personal assistant to Mrs. Eleanor Pierce required her to maintain the doctor's study and laboratory, creating opportunities for systematic education that would have been impossible to obtain through conventional channels available to enslaved people.
In future resistance activities, her study of toxicology texts provided scientific validation for traditional plant knowledge that Martha Webb had shared, demonstrating how folk medicine and academic science could be integrated to achieve remarkable precision in chemical intervention. Mrs. Eleanor Pierce's social activities as a prominent member of Charleston's literary society exposed Sarah to intellectual conversations about philosophy, politics, and cultural developments that broadened her understanding of the ideological frameworks that sustained slavery throughout the South. Her role in serving tea and maintaining household order during these gatherings positioned her to observe discussions about abolitionist activities, political tensions between slave and free states, and most importantly, the psychological anxieties that were beginning to affect even the most confident defenders of human bondage. The conversations Sarah overheard revealed growing uncertainty among Charleston's elite about the long-term sustainability of slavery in the face of increasing political pressure from northern states and international criticism of American human bondage practices. Their private discussions acknowledged economic vulnerabilities and social tensions that contradicted the confident public rhetoric that characterized official Southern responses to abolitionist challenges, demonstrating that even committed slavery advocates recognized fundamental problems with the system they defended. Dr. Pierce's medical practice brought Sarah into contact with other enslaved people throughout Charleston's wealthy districts, creating opportunities to share knowledge and techniques that could enhance their survival capabilities while maintaining the appearance of routine social interaction among domestic servants. These networks operated with sophistication that would have surprised white authorities, facilitating communication and mutual support that transcended individual household boundaries while remaining invisible to surveillance efforts. Among the enslaved people Sarah encountered was an elderly man named Solomon Rivers, who had spent 40 years as butler to one of Charleston's most prominent banking families, while secretly maintaining detailed records of business conversations that revealed financial vulnerabilities throughout the regional economy. Solomon's intelligence gathering represented the kind of systematic resistance that operated continuously beneath the surface of apparent accommodation, demonstrating that Sarah's intellectual achievements were part of a broader pattern of covert activities that challenged slavery's psychological foundations.
The relationship Sarah developed with Solomon provided her with insights into the economic structures that sustained Charleston's slave-based prosperity, revealing specific weaknesses that could be exploited through targeted interventions that would appear to be market fluctuations rather than deliberate sabotage. His knowledge of banking practices, investment patterns, and commercial relationships enabled Sarah to understand how individual actions could create cascading effects throughout the interconnected systems that depended on enslaved labor for profitability. Solomon's guidance helped Sarah recognize that her operation against Colonel Whitmore represented only the beginning of potential resistance activities that could employ her intellectual capabilities to challenge slavery's economic foundations rather than merely achieving personal revenge. The systematic approach she had developed for analyzing human behavior, chemical intervention, and environmental manipulation could be adapted to target the financial mechanisms that made human bondage profitable for the planter class. The knowledge Sarah gained about Charleston's commercial operations revealed opportunities for economic warfare that would be far more devastating than individual acts of violence, while remaining virtually undetectable to authorities whose understanding of enslaved people's capabilities prevented them from recognizing sophisticated planning. Her study of Dr. Pierce's financial records provided detailed information about investment strategies, insurance practices, and banking relationships that could be vulnerable to careful manipulation by someone with inside access and sufficient patience. Dr. Pierce's academic interests in racial science provided Sarah with intimate knowledge of the intellectual frameworks that white society used to justify human bondage, revealing psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited through evidence that contradicted fundamental assumptions about Black intellectual capacity. His private correspondence with other researchers included discussions about anomalous cases that challenged racial theories, demonstrating that even committed scientific racists harbored doubts about conclusions that formed the ideological foundation of slavery. The scientific research Dr. Pierce conducted involved measurements and observations designed to support theories of racial hierarchy, but his private notes revealed inconsistencies and contradictions that undermined his public conclusions while creating psychological tensions he struggled to resolve. Sarah's access to these materials provided her with understanding of how scientific racism functioned as ideology rather than empirical investigation, knowledge that could be used to challenge its credibility through carefully orchestrated demonstrations of Black intellectual achievement. The social connections Mrs. Pierce maintained with Charleston's literary establishment exposed Sarah to debates about slavery's moral and philosophical implications that revealed significant disagreement among the city's intellectual elite about the institution's long-term viability. These conversations included private acknowledgments of slavery's ethical problems that contradicted public defenses of human bondage, demonstrating that even committed defenders of the system harbored psychological conflicts that could be exploited through proper manipulation. Sarah's observation of these intellectual discussions enabled her to identify specific individuals whose private doubts about slavery could be intensified through targeted interventions that would appear to be natural developments in their thinking rather than external manipulation. Her understanding of human psychology, developed through years of studying plantation behavior patterns, proved equally applicable to urban intellectual environments where different kinds of pressure could achieve similar results. The political tensions that characterized Charleston during the mid-1850s created opportunities for resistance activities that would have been impossible in more stable periods, as increasing paranoia about abolitionist infiltration caused authorities to focus their attention on external
threats while remaining blind to internal resistance conducted by people whose capabilities they systematically underestimated. Sarah recognized these conditions as potentially decisive for implementing broader operations that could challenge slavery's economic and psychological foundations. The Kansas-Nebraska Act's implementation had intensified debates about slavery's expansion into new territories, creating political instability that made Charleston's elite increasingly anxious about their long-term security while simultaneously reducing their attention to local surveillance activities. These circumstances provided cover for resistance operations that could operate with reduced risk of detection while targeting vulnerabilities that political pressure had already begun to expose. Sarah's analysis of regional conditions convinced her that individual acts of revenge, however sophisticated, would be insufficient to address the systematic oppression that characterized slavery throughout the South. Her intellectual capabilities could be more effectively employed in operations that challenged the economic and ideological foundations of human bondage, rather than merely eliminating specific oppressors who would inevitably be replaced by equally brutal alternatives. The network of resistance contacts Sarah developed during her time in Charleston included free blacks, sympathetic whites, and enslaved people whose combined knowledge and capabilities could support operations of unprecedented scope and sophistication. These alliances transcended the individual household focus that had characterized her revenge against Colonel Whitmore, creating possibilities for coordinated activities that could affect entire economic sectors rather than single plantation operations. Among her most valuable contacts was Marcus Thompson, a free black carpenter whose construction work provided him with access to the homes and businesses of Charleston's wealthiest families, while his literacy and numerical skills enabled him to understand financial documents and architectural plans that revealed security vulnerabilities throughout the city. Marcus had spent 15 years developing intelligence networks that operated with professional competence while remaining completely invisible to white surveillance efforts. The intelligence Marcus had accumulated included detailed information about bank security procedures, warehouse storage systems, shipping schedules, and insurance practices that protected Charleston's slave-based economy from conventional threats while remaining vulnerable to interventions conducted by people with inside access and sufficient technical knowledge. His architectural expertise enabled him to identify structural weaknesses in buildings that housed crucial records and financial instruments. Sarah's collaboration with Marcus revealed possibilities for economic warfare that could disrupt Charleston slave trading operations without requiring direct violence, while creating financial losses that would force reconsideration of human bondage's profitability. Their combined knowledge of chemistry, construction, and financial systems enabled them to develop plans for interventions that would appear to be accidents or natural disasters rather than deliberate sabotage. The operations Sarah and Marcus designed targeted the insurance companies that protected slave investments, the banks that financed plantation purchases, and the shipping firms that transported human cargo between markets, recognizing that slavery's profitability depended on complex financial systems that could be disrupted through careful intervention at crucial points. Their plans emphasized creating cascading failures that would appear to be market corrections rather than coordinated attacks. Dr. Pierce's medical practice brought Sarah into contact with prominent families whose financial records revealed the extent to which Charleston's entire economy depended on slave labor for profitability, demonstrating that targeted disruption of specific operations could create instability throughout the regional economic system. Her access to household financial documents provided intelligence that would have been impossible to obtain through external observation. The knowledge Sarah gained about insurance practices that protected slave investments revealed specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited through chemical interventions that would appear to be natural causes of death rather than deliberate poisoning. Her understanding of how actuarial calculations determined insurance premiums enabled her to recognize how systematic losses could make slave ownership economically unsustainable for individual planters. The shipping operations that transported enslaved people between markets represented another target for systematic intervention that could disrupt the domestic slave trade without requiring direct confrontation with authorities. Sarah's study of maritime schedules and cargo handling procedures revealed opportunities for chemical sabotage that could create losses significant enough to affect market prices while appearing to be accidents caused by poor storage conditions. The financial networks that connected Charleston slave markets to plantation operations throughout the region could be disrupted through targeted interventions that affected crucial documents, communication systems, and transportation infrastructure. Sarah's understanding of how information flowed between different components of the slave trading system enabled her to identify points where disruption would create maximum confusion while minimizing the risk of detection. The psychological warfare implications of systematic economic disruption appealed to Sarah's recognition that challenging slavery's profitability would force reconsideration of the ideological justifications that sustained human bondage throughout Southern society. Her experience with Colonel Whitmore had demonstrated that individual revenge, however satisfying, produced limited impact on the broader system that continued to oppress millions of people. The intellectual satisfaction Sarah derived from planning complex operations that challenged slavery's foundations exceeded even the emotional gratification she had experienced from achieving revenge against her mother's killer. Her capabilities had evolved beyond personal grievance into systematic resistance that could contribute to broader struggles for human freedom while demonstrating the intellectual potential that slavery was designed to suppress. By late 1855, Sarah Bennett had established herself as a central figure in Charleston's
underground resistance networks, while maintaining perfect cover as a grateful and competent domestic servant whose capabilities appeared to match exactly the limitations that white society expected from enslaved people. Her transformation from individual avenger into strategic coordinator of systematic resistance represented intellectual evolution that challenged every assumption about the supposed natural order of racial hierarchy. The operations Sarah coordinated during her Charleston period created financial losses throughout the regional slave trading system, while appearing to be unrelated accidents that could be attributed to natural causes rather than human intervention. Her success in conducting economic warfare without detection demonstrated that enslaved people's intellectual capabilities, when properly organized and systematically applied, could challenge slavery's profitability more effectively than external abolitionist activities. The network Sarah established included individuals whose combined knowledge and capabilities rivaled those of professional intelligence organizations, achieving coordination and security that enabled complex operations while maintaining complete invisibility to authorities whose assumptions about Black intellectual capacity prevented recognition of the sophisticated planning that surrounded them daily. Her leadership of these activities proved that the most dangerous resistance to slavery came from within the system itself. Sarah Bennett's story reveals that the apparent stability of antebellum Southern society depended on willful ignorance about the intellectual capabilities of enslaved people, whose minds could not be permanently suppressed through legal restrictions or physical violence. Her achievements demonstrated that human intelligence, when focused through years of patient planning and systematic preparation, could overcome advantages of legal authority, economic resources, and social position. The deliberate erasure of Sarah Bennett's activities from historical records follows patterns that characterize official responses to other demonstrations of Black intellectual achievement during the antebellum period, revealing systematic efforts to suppress evidence that challenged the ideological foundations of human bondage. Her invisibility in conventional historical narratives represents not accidental oversight, but coordinated suppression designed to protect psychological assumptions that made slavery seem morally acceptable to white society. The legacy of Sarah Bennett's resistance extends beyond individual achievement into broader questions about human potential that slavery was designed to deny, proving that limitations imposed through social and legal restrictions were artificial rather than natural. Her intellectual accomplishments, achieved despite having no formal education or access to conventional resources, demonstrated capabilities that exceeded those of most professionally trained individuals while remaining hidden from recognition by the very people who claimed superiority over her. Colonel Edmund Whitmore died never knowing that the woman who served him tea while planning his destruction possessed strategic capabilities that exceeded his own,
proving that intellectual achievement could remain invisible to those whose assumptions prevented recognition of what surrounded them daily. Sarah Bennett's perfect crime represented more than revenge, but demonstration that apparent powerlessness could mask capabilities that would reshape the world when properly applied through patient planning and systematic execution. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.